Hello, friends. My name is Willard Knipp, and I have the privilege of serving as the senior pastor at Pikeville United Methodist Church in Pikeville, Kentucky. In these days when we are battling the coronavirus, we've had to get creative with how we do things like Bible studies. And this video Bible study of the life and the ministry of the Apostle Paul has, we hope, been helpful along the way. Well, if we've been able to do anything to help you grow in your faith and your knowledge of God's Word and help better prepare you to live as one of God's disciples in this world, we're thankful for that. Before we get started with tonight's lesson together, let's bow for a word of prayer, shall we? Our Heavenly Father, we do bow in your presence tonight and give you thanks for the gift of this day of life with which you have blessed us. We ask, Lord, that you would take this time as we look at the life and the ministry of your servant, Paul, and help us to learn more about your word and how to live it out in this world as your people called the church. Help us, O God, to take not just facts and knowledge, but help us to learn truth and wisdom that will better equip us to be your church in this world. We continue to pray for all those impacted by the coronavirus, from the medical professionals on the front lines and the clerks in the stores and people who stock the shelves to make sure that we have what we need, to those who are suffering, those who are stricken not only with this disease, but those who are grieving and those who are physically ill from other things unrelated to COVID, who've had their lives adversely impacted by this time as well. We look forward to a day when we can be together again, but for right now, we just thank you that you've given us this gift. And we offer this prayer in your name and for the sake of your great kingdom. Amen. Well, if you were with us last time, you know that we looked at the writings of Paul from this second missionary journey, and we looked at the letters to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and the Galatian church. But tonight we're going to pick up and we're going to look more at Paul's third missionary journey. Paul's third missionary journey is one that is discussed in the Bible in the book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 23 through chapter 21, verse 17. The trip itself is believed to have been somewhere between 4 and 5 years in length. Again, as we mentioned from the very beginning of this video series, the dates in study of Paul's life and the events of the book of Acts never are in complete agreement by all scholars. Everyone has a slightly different view, but within the range of what is considered to be an acceptable number, those dates will vary from his third missionary trip starting as early as the year 52 and completing in the year 58. Again, those dates vary. The journey itself was one that covered roughly 2,500 miles in the ancient world. Now, between the second and third missionary journey, Paul took some time in what appears to have become his new home. As much as Paul could have a home in. There are those scholars who suggest that Paul might well have written the book of Galatians while he was there during that time period as well. Uh, we do know that Paul retraced many of his steps from his second missionary journey, but often he was alone in doing so because his apprentices would often make shorter trips, like Timothy would go off on a side journey, as it were. We'll see just a little bit more about that later. In book of Acts, the 18th chapter, we learn that Paul starts this journey not by ocean, but by going overland from Syria, Antioch, through what is today the land of Turkey, what is in the ancient world called Asia Minor, the region of Galatia, and the region of Phrygia as well. Most likely, he was visiting the churches that he had helped establish on his first missionary journey. On his second missionary journey, he had not connected with these folks. And so now, roughly 10 years or 5 to 7 years later, he is reconnecting with those folks on this missionary journey. He arrives in Ephesus and spends the overwhelming majority of his third missionary journey in Ephesus. The consensus among biblical scholars is 3 years. You'll see the dates 2 years, 3 years used very commonly. I've never seen anybody say 4, nor have I seen anybody ever say 1. So 2 to 3, with 3 being understood to be the consensus. When he first arrived in Ephesus, he repeated his practice of having preached in a synagogue. He had been to Ephesus briefly on the second missionary journey, not very long at all though, but he did preach for a time at the synagogue until he got crossways, as he often did, with the rulers of the synagogue over his insistence that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. And so after a time, he begins to preach at what the book of Acts tells us is in the hall of Tyrannus. Tyrannus was known as a teacher in the ancient world. So what we're looking at here, in all probability, is Paul is renting, or is perhaps given the use of a teaching facility by the professor, by the tutor, who would have taught in the early morning. The ancient world's patterns were a little different than ours. Their day started a little earlier than we tend to, also ends a little earlier than we tend to. And so the school instruction would have probably been over sometime in the range of 11 a.m. And that at that point, Paul would have been free to use the hall that afternoon, when most people would have had lunch and then gone on, taken a nap, and gotten out of the midday heat. It is thought that Paul most likely wrote 1 Corinthians from Ephesus while he's on his third missionary journey. Now, while Paul is in Ephesus, Timothy and the others, as I mentioned earlier, basically use Ephesus as a hub, and then they go out and they are teaching and visiting some of the other brothers and sisters in the region, but Ephesus appears to be their base of operations. Paul's tenure in Ephesus comes to a close when he irritates the people who create idols. Ephesus was a big center for pagan worship. A major economic factor in that time was the creation of idols that would be worshiped or used in the worship of pagan gods. Paul's preaching that there is no God other than the one true God, and that Jesus is the Son of God, caused many to get rid of their idols, to destroy their idols, and this upset the idol makers, who turned the crowd against Paul and led to a riot. So Paul left Ephesus after the period of roughly 3 years and went from there into Macedonia. Now today we understand Macedonia as being Europe, where in Macedonia he basically traveled to churches in that region. These are churches he saw on the second missionary journey, most likely Thessalonica, Berea, and Philippi. While there, he would have most likely written 2 Corinthians. So Paul travels then on down into Greece, in the city of Corinth, which is a seaport, where he spends 3 months. He's already written them. By now we know 3 letters. 1st and 2nd Corinthians we still have in our Bible today. But in 1st Corinthians, Paul references a previous letter. And in 2nd Corinthians, he refers to something called a severe letter. So it's possible that he may have written the Corinthians as many as 4 times or more. We have 2 in our Bibles today. But he travels now to be with the Corinthian people, where he spends 3 months. And it is thought that he wrote the letter to the church at Rome, the book of Romans, while he was there. Now we know that he was preparing to return home from Corinth. But as Luke tells us in Acts, there were some Jewish individuals, Jewish leaders, who were in an uproar over Paul's preaching of Jesus as the Messiah, who were basically planning to waylay him before he boarded the ship to go to Syria. And so what he did was he left and went back by land, back through Macedonia, to retrace his steps once that plot had been discovered. From Philippi, Paul sails on to Troas, and we find one of the more funny moments, I guess you could say, in all of the New Testament. It is late at night. Paul's with this group of Christian believers. He's talking with them, he's preaching, and he's going long. late into the evening. Luke tells us in Acts there were many candles in the room. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot to us today, but in the ancient world, that would have meant the room was hot. It was probably filled with people. The candles were adding to the heat. And so a young man named Eutychus is sitting on the windowsill trying to get a breath of cool air while Paul keeps going on and on and on. And suddenly, Eutychus falls asleep and falls out of the third-story window and is dead. And Paul comes and throws himself over top of Eutychus and proclaims that he is alive, and indeed Eutychus is alive. But the idea of somebody falling asleep at church is not anything new. From Troas, Paul travels overland to Assos, meets a ship. Some of his colleagues had already boarded the ship and gone on. He meets the ship there at Assos and then sets sail to Miletus. Now, Miletus is a couple days' journey from Ephesus, and so he knew he was going to be there only for a brief time, and so he sent word to the Ephesian elders. Now, remember, these are the folks that he just spent basically 3 years with, and so he's quite close with them. So he sends word, come and see me, and so they make the journey to Miletus from Ephesus, and there's a very emotional scene there painted by Luke in the book of Acts when basically Paul says to them, now I know that I will never see you again. And so a very emotional time for all of them. From Miletus, Paul sets sail to Caesarea. This is not Caesarea Philippi, but Caesarea Maritime. It is in what is today northern Israel. It is a seaport. On his way to Caesarea, we know that he at least changes boats one time, gets to the city of Tyre, and spends a whole week there, gets to know the sisters and brothers in that area. And then upon arriving in Caesarea, he would have stayed, Luke tells us, with Philip. This is the Philip from Acts chapter 8, who met with the Ethiopian eunuch, who was one of the 7 deacons chosen to help feed the Grecian widows, the Greek widows in the early church. While they are at Philip's home, a prophet from Judea named Agabus comes to see Paul. And there he removes Paul's belt and ties his own, Agabus, ties his own hands and feet together and basically prophesies that this is what is going to happen to Paul if he goes on to Jerusalem. And more than once during this time, people tried to talk Paul out of going to Jerusalem because they felt it was too dangerous for him to do so. But he said basically, I've got to do this. How could I deny my Lord in this way? So from Caesarea, Paul makes what is a short journey down to Jerusalem, excuse me, where he stays with Manason. That is not a typo. That is actually the guy's name, Manason, who is an early disciple of Jesus from the city or from the island of Cyprus. Now, if you look at this map of the ancient world, you'll see that Paul's trip started out at Syrian Antioch, went through Galatia and Phrygia into Asia Minor, where he gets to Ephesus, where he spends the 3 years, on up into the areas where he eventually crosses from Troas over into Macedonia. Here he meets with the church at Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, goes on down to Greece, to Corinth, and then he's actually had it in mind to go from Corinth back to Syria, but then this murder plot was discovered, so he retraces his steps, goes back and sees the folks, leaves from Troas, sails to Miletus, where he meets with the Ephesian elders, and then he goes on from there to make his way back to Caesarea Maritime in what is today northern Israel. So, this is Paul's third missionary journey. And during this third missionary journey, as you may have heard me mention, he writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians and the book of Romans. Next week in this video, we're going to examine those 3 books, albeit briefly, and hopefully you'll be able to be with us for that. Our Bible studies are posted on YouTube. As you can see, because that's where I will be tonight, there'll be a link posted on Facebook. As always, if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to drop me an email or give me a phone call. I'd love to hear somebody just to know that you even watched it. But we love to know that this is doing some good in your life. Thank you for being with us this evening. I hope this adds to your knowledge of the faith, but more than that, I hope it helps you grow in your faith. Our desire is not that you can win a game of Bible trivia, but that you can be an equipped disciple of Jesus Christ. And that's why we make this happen. To God be the glory. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for being with us.